Okay, this is my persuasive speech for Communications 101. This is Larry Dahl. Do you remember what you were doing November 8th of 2000? If you were like 80% of the Americans, you were enthralled in the presidential election results of the Bush-Gore campaigns. Recounts and courtroom drama went on for 37 days. You could hear it on the news at night. You could read it in the papers in the morning. It was everywhere. Now for the important question. Were you part of the 51%? What's the 51%, you ask? That's the actual percentage of voters that voted in the 2000 election. Of the other 49%, according to a CNN poll, they wish they had voted. The 2000 election was a great example of how important each person's vote is. Many Americans have lost interest in the voting process. John Funn tells us that the United States ranks 139th out of 163 democracies in the rate of voter participation in his book, Stealing Elections. Most voters feel that they won't be represented anyway, so why get in the car, drive to the polling station, and cast their votes for a candidate? These people may have in fact been the difference in the 2000 election of whether George Bush was elected president or not elected president. Let's look at a couple of races that have been close in the past. The most tightly contested race before the 2000 Bush-Gore election was in 1960 between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Kennedy won the popular vote by 118,827 votes. Nixon carried 26 of the states, while Kennedy carried 22 of the states. Kennedy ended up winning the electoral vote by a vote of 303 to 219. By contrast, in 2000, Al Gore won the popular vote by 543,816 votes. Bush carried 30 states compared to Gore's 20 states plus the District of Columbia. Bush came out with 271 electoral votes compared to Al Gore's 266. Again, the recount went on in Florida for over a month before the Supreme Court ended up stepping in and stopping the recount process. The final count in Florida gave Bush the win by 537 votes. That's 1/9 of a percentage point of the total votes cast in the Florida election in 2000. Let's compare some of the numbers over the 40-year span between the Kennedy and Nixon election and the Gore and Bush election. In Thomas Patterson's book, The Vanishing Voter, in 1960, 68.8 million adults voted and 40.8 million adults did not vote. In 1996, 96.3 Americans voted and 100.2 million stayed at home and did not vote. The 1996 turnout plummeted to 49%. This represented the first time since 1920 that the turnout for a vote was less than 50% of eligible voters to vote. The U.S. had 100 million more people in 2000 than they did in 1960. Yet during the October presidential elections, more people watched in 1960 than they did in the 2000 election cycle. The argument has been made that there's a large difference between ineligible voters between the 1960s and 2000. When voting rates are adjusted, for the ineligible voters in the decline is voters of 9%. The decline is 9%. To put that number in context, if that 9% had showed up for the election of 2000, there would have been 18 million more voters in the 2000 election cycle. That would have been like having 24 of the states in the United States voting combined for the 2000 election. Turnout for the presidential primaries has dropped since 1970s as well. Nearly 30% of all adults in states with primary voting voted in 1972 and 1976. In comparison, in 2000, that number dwindled to 17%. And in 1996, when only the Republicans had a contested race, that number dropped even further to 13% of the total Americans that could vote. The trend in congressional midterm elections has been no less alarming. Voting was nearly 50% in the 1960s. It was barely above the 40s in the 1970s, and has averaged 37% since then. Politics is prone to what political scientists Sidney Verba, K. Lehman Schlossman, and Henry Brady call participatory distortion. Citizens of higher income, education, and age are greatly overrepresented in nearly every political activity, from contacting legislators to contributing money. But voting is the least distorted activity. As I'll show you, the American public has become disinterested in the election process. During the past half century, there has been a revolution in higher education and mass communication. Citizens have never had as much information available to them or been better equipped to handle that information. Research indicates, however, that Americans are no better informed today than they were 50 years ago about the election politics. The 24 primary debates in 2000 drew 1.8 million viewers on average. This represents almost a fifth of the audience of a regular primetime television show. If debates had been a television series, they would have been dropped after their first episode. To put Americans' priorities in focus, the first Democratic debate in the 2000 elections went head-to-head with a WWF, World Wrestling Federation, wrestling match. The wrestlers won in viewership by 4 times what the debates polled. They had 7.2 million people watch the wrestling. This brings to the forefront that an inattentive public is an uninformed one. In conclusion, Donald Green says in his book, Getting Out the Vote, that the United States has the busiest election calendar on earth. Thanks to the many layers of federal, state, and local government, Americans have more opportunities to vote each decade than Britons, Germans, Japanese have in their lifetime. The election process has opened to just about everyone in the United States. There are new ways to register. There are new places to register. And according to Michael Alvarez in his book, Point, Click, and Vote, we have even begun to work on internet voting systems. The idea of cutting the trip to the polls will help accommodate many people who aren't able to get to the polling stations. But we must be careful when we go into this, because this can open doors to voter fraud. I ask you today, will you make the upcoming election another 2000 election where just over half of the eligible voters will vote? Or will you do your duty as a citizen of the United States and get out of your house on election day and vote? As the political scientists Stephen Rosenstone and John Mark Hansen note, the idle go unheard. They do not speak up, define the agenda, frame the issues, or affect the choices leaders make. A couple of things you can do now. You can go to www.indianavoters.com. This will explain the many different places that you can go and register. Or if you'd like, I have a couple of forms here so that you can sign on the dotted line today and make sure you get your vote counted. Just make sure with the coming presidential election, you have to register within 29 days of the election so that you will be able to vote.